So John, I understand you've been involved with Riccarton Bush for quite a while. When did you get involved with it in the beginning?
Well, I came up to Christchurch in 1995 from Peel Forest. I've been managing Peel Forest Reserve for quite a while and decided to come to town, and I've been looking after the bush since then, which is getting on for 14 years now.
Great. So you must have seen a lot of changes in that time.
There has been. I've noticed the bush change. Surprisingly, in that time, the bush has thickened up. I've noticed it. And there's been some very good projects I've been involved in, putting irrigation in and, of course, putting the fence in.
Well, we'll come to the fence soon.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe we'll just, first of all, where is Riccarton Bush, for the sake of those watching this?
Okay, well, just about half of Christchurch probably would call it Dean's Bush, and they would know that it is reasonably close to Riccarton Mall. Most people know where Riccarton Mall is, and if you go on the car park above the mall and look across to the west, about 300 metres away is a big wall of trees, and that's Riccarton Bush, right there in Riccarton.
So how did it get to be called Dean's Bush as well as Riccarton Bush? Who were the Deanses?
Well, the Deans were the first European family to settle and start farming in the area, and they arrived in 1843. And so the name Deans came from the Deans family.
And did they pass it on to because it's now a reserve, isn't it? So
yes, it is. It was actually gifted to the people of Christchurch in 1914. The Deans, the Maori people, of course, were there long before the Deans, and they had a name for it. They called it Putaringa Motu. And when the Deans arrived, they came from a parish in Scotland called Riccarton, hence the name Riccarton. And they changed the name to Riccarton Bush, and they lived there from 1843 until well, the Deans actually were there living in the big house that was built after the Dean's cottage. They lived there till just before the war.
And Putaringa Motu, what does that mean?
Well,
the Maori name.
The Maori name, loosely translated, means place of an echo. It's thought that people could put their ear to the ground and hear footsteps.
Right.
I'm not sure how that works, but
sure. And what makes it so special? I mean, why is it so valuable?
Well, it's a tiny remnant of a forest that once covered most of the floodplain of the Waimakariri River, and it was a vast forest covering much of Christchurch. And the Maori fires, of course, destroyed a lot of the fires on the Canterbury Plains. When the Europeans arrived, most of the forest had gone. The Europeans, when they got here, were hungry for timber. There were some remnants to the north of the city around Rangiora, Wood End. There was quite a sizable piece of bush at Papanui and the bush at Riccarton. And so there wasn't a lot. And all the rest that I've just mentioned have gone. Riccarton's the only survivor, and that makes it really special. We consider it to be a national treasure. It's so valuable.
So looking around Christchurch with all those wooden houses, I mean, there must have been a huge demand for any wood available. It's a miracle that it survived, isn't it?
I think it is. The pressure on the Deans is well documented. That even the local council of the day wanted to get rid of Riccarton Bush and wanted to get in there and use the timber. And the fact that it survived really is due to the fact that the Deans were people who appreciated trees. We know that because they planted a lot of trees from different countries. They love trees. If there'd have been a family from Europe who arrived there before the Deans and started farming at that spot alongside the bush, and they'd have been people who didn't appreciate trees, then for sure it would have been gone.
Right.
It wouldn't have survived. We're very, very lucky it's there.
And what are the main trees that you would see there? The main species of trees.
Okay. Well, the dominant tree in Riccarton Bush is the kahikatea, or white pine, as it was called by the Europeans. There are several other. Well, there were 4 native conifers: the miro. There wouldn't have been many of those. The matai, the totara, and the kahikatea. Quite a few of them were taken out. Even the deans themselves did use some timber from the bush in the early days, so the matai and the totara were more useful to them for building.
Yep.
So there's no big old matai and totara there. There's absolutely no miro at all. When they disappeared, we're not quite sure.
Right.
But the majority of trees, even in the early days, would have been kahikatea because the ground was reasonably wet, and kahikatea thrive on wet ground. So they're the native conifers, and then there's a whole host of broadleafed hardwood trees in the bush, and there's many different species.
So how big is it? I mean, as a pocket?
Well, it's tiny. When you're in there, you really get the impression you're in a big forest. You could be on the west coast, but actually, when you're right in the middle of it, you're only about 250 metres from the busiest road in the South Island.
So and roughly how many hectares would it be?
Hectares is 7.8. Yeah, it's just under 20 acres.
Yep.
So it's not very big.
Yeah. It was once part of a floodplain forest, and I guess Christchurch, to build houses, a lot of that was drained. Has that affected the forest at all? I mean, is it still wet enough for those trees?
Yes, it certainly did affect it. I think I'm not sure exactly where the water table was, but the original forests across Christchurch would have had plenty of water from the flooding Waimakariri, the water table being higher, and the bush does suffer in hot, dry summers. February, March time, it gets very dry, but we have installed an irrigation system in the year 2000, and that's really helped a lot. The big trees probably don't suffer as much. They've got their roots way down, and there is an aquifer 4 or 5 metres down, which has got some water running through it. So the big trees have their roots down into the aquifers, but the smaller trees, the seedlings, the ferns, they've got no hope in dry periods.
So you irrigate those?
We do.
At dry times?
Yes.
Well, when did you first decide to build a predator-proof fence, and why does it need one?
Well, when I first arrived there in the 90s, after being there a year or two, I really started to notice that we couldn't really kill off all the possums. There was a possum population there of sometimes up to 20, and it was difficult to get them all. And they keep coming out of the surrounding gardens anyway, so we had a possum problem. But the main noticeable thing were the domestic cats. There were always domestic cats coming out of the surrounding gardens. And of course you can't control that. You can't knock too many cats on the head without getting yourself into trouble. So I started thinking about building a fence just to keep the cats out. And then at about that time, the Karori fence in Wellington was put up, and the Excluder Fencing Company had set themselves up in the Waikato as a company that just specialised in predator-free fencing. So of course we started to have a look and talk to those people.
So when you talk about a predator-proof fence, what kinds of things does it have to stop?
Well, it needs to stop possums and cats, of course, so it's got to be reasonably high so they can't jump over. And if I could just show this is a steel capping that goes right around the top, so it's on an angle about like that.
Which is the outside of the fence?
This is the outside.
Yes.
So anything jumping up, it just can't get a hold, and nothing can come from underneath. The wire mesh, and this is the mesh of the fence itself, is about here. It's here.
Yep.
So nothing can actually come up here and get over. So anything like a mouse or a rat just can't get in there. So we're looking at mice, or rodents, mice, rats, possums, cats, hedgehogs, and if there's any in the area, stoats, weasels, ferrets, but we haven't really got a problem with those.
So you have to think about what animals can squeeze through, what they can climb over.
We do indeed. What they can dig under? Well, the fence comes down and then it curves and lies flat on the ground like that, and we have some soil thrown on the top. So anything digs hits the mesh. Right. And this is small enough to keep out even baby mice. I think at the Karori Sanctuary they had problems because their mesh was a little bit bigger and baby mice were able to get in, and they've since had lots of problems with that.
So there's a lot to the design.
Yeah, there is. In fact, when they built this, when the predator fence people set their company up, they built the fence in a circle, and they had this piece on the inside, and they put animals inside, and they had cameras set up day and night, and they left food on the outside, and they had to keep adjusting it until even the best jumper, which was a tomcat, couldn't get out, and then they knew they had it beat.
That's an interesting story. So I imagine building a fence like that is actually quite expensive. Do you have some idea of how much it costs for a metre of that sort of fence?
Well, that was one of the first things we had to do. We made some inquiries with the excluder fencing company, and we could work it out. We knew how far we had to fence. It was about 1.2 kilometres.
Yes.
And so we talked to them, and we got an idea how much money we'd need. And a little while after that, we didn't have the money. We had to go fundraising, and fortunately, by a stroke of luck, our botanist, who's a bush trustee, Dr. Brian Malloy, who's been involved with the bush for about 30 years, he was talking to a gentleman by the name of Grant Nelson of the Gamma Foundation.
Yes.
And Grant is well known in conservation circles as somebody who's generously funded a lot of conservation projects, and he offered to pay for the materials of the fence and for the construction of the fence.
Fantastic.
So that was the real crunch. I think if that hadn't have happened, we wouldn't really have a fence today. And then, of course, there were he paid for the materials and the construction, but there were quite a few other costs. Resource consent, for instance, cost a lot of money. I think for our fence it was somewhere in the region of $30,000, which is a lot of money. We had to clear a 4-metre strip right round the outside of the fence, and that was quite costly. I think
so
overall...
Why do you have to have such a wide strip?
Well, that's a no-jump zone. It
Okay.
doesn't have to be only 4 metres on the ground. It has to be 4 metres where the trees hang over, so nothing can jump from the outside in. So that was quite a costly job, getting rid of that. We did have to sacrifice some of the bush on the outside because we had to survey the true boundary with our neighbours, and then we had to come in 4 metres to build our predator fence. So there were extra costs. So we went fundraising, and we had, I think it was 5 other funders. The Canterbury Foundation gave us money, the Canterbury Community Trust, the DOC Biodiversity Fund gave us money, the Christchurch City Council, the Stout Foundation, and the World Wildlife Fund. They all gave us money. So
it's fantastic, isn't it? So it was a real community effort.
It was, and everybody chipped in, and it was reasonably costly. But when you consider, I think the final cost for the fence was about $280,000. That was all up, everything. And when you consider what it's protecting, I think we got a good bargain there.
Yes.
Yeah.
And once you've got the fence up, I mean, what happens then? I guess how do you get people in and out of the bush without animals going in?
Okay, well, the fence installation was reasonably easy. If there was ever going to be an easy place to build a predator fence, it was Riccarton Bush. It's flat, it's not very big, there's no streams or rivers running through. There is a ditch, which we had to put a tunnel through, but it was reasonably easy to fence. The hardest bit is the entrance gate. And you have to have 2 gates, and you have a distance between the 2, and only 1 gate opens at a time. Because as you would know, mice can nip in. They do it in people's houses. They nip in whilst you're going in the door. So we had to make sure that mice particularly couldn't get in. So there's a double gate system, and out of all the problems that we've had with the fence, and we haven't had that many, but if there is a problem, it's usually with the gate. Some of the local lads have discovered that if they put a stick under 1 gate and just prop it open, then people can't get out or can't get in. And there's just one.
You should edit that out.
Maybe we had. Maybe we should. But that's just one of the problems. But because it's an electric and there's electricity involved, you can get problems. In fact, we had a lightning strike on the fence a few months ago, and it knocked out all the electronics on the gate when we couldn't operate them.
Okay. And then I also understand that once you build a fence, you need to patrol it inside to make sure that you don't actually trap predators or mice on the inside, where of course it would be paradise for them.
Yeah, exactly. Well, once the fence was up, we did have a big job of getting out all the predators that were still in there.
What did you find in there?
Well, the local cats, of course. Anything can climb out of the fence, but they can't get back in.
Okay.
So if there were any cats, and we don't know for sure whether there was at that time when we completely enclosed it, but if there were, they climbed out that night and went home, and then they couldn't get back in. So no more problem with cats at all.
Yes.
And we've never had a cat in there since. The possums were a little bit more difficult. It took us roughly 3 months to get the last possum. We had a couple of wily old possums that didn't want to get into a trap or didn't take the bait. So it wasn't that easy, but we did get the possums. The most difficult animals were the rodents. The rats, it took us quite a while to get all the rats. But of course, once we got the rats and the cats, there was nothing to kill the mice, so the mice population really exploded. And we just had to keep hammering away at the mice population. It took us just over a year to get the last mouse out of there.
And how did you know you had the last mouse?
Well, we kept thinking we got the last mouse. We'd think, yeah, we've done it, no more bait being touched, because we have roughly 400 bait stations out in the bush, which I could show you one or two of them actually.
Sure.
We have these. We have to put bait in a container because if we don't, the blackbirds eat it. And this is non-poison bait. This is bait that we have out all the time. So we have a piece of bait in there, and we check these weekly. And if it's been...
What's the point of a non-poison bait?
Well, the point of a non-poison bait is that we can tell if something's in there. They immediately go to these bait stations and start eating it.
Yes.
So we check them weekly. If something's been nibbled, we know immediately what it is. We actually use these as well, and we just put our bait inside like that, and we prop it up against a tree root so only a mouse can get in.
Right.
Now, if a rat comes along and wants to get in, we have it pinned down. A rat won't muck around; he'll just chew out the back of it like that. And
effective teeth.
Yeah. So we know immediately whether we've got a rat in there or whether we've got a mouse. And in 4 years that the fence has been up, we've had one rat get in, and we've had some mice get in. And what happens, we immediately know, pretty quickly anyway, within a week whether there's something there or not. So we then flood the area with poison bait.
Right.
And we know that they're coming back and feeding on it because we see it being taken.
Yes.
And we know that we've got them. And reasonably quickly, within a week or 10 days, the nibbling stops and we know we've got on top of it.
So you were saying you've only had 2 breaches that you know of?
2 breaches that we know
of. Since the fence has been
That's correct.
cleared?
Yeah.
It's pretty good, isn't it?
It's pretty good, yeah, we're very pleased with that. I think, these type of fences that have been put up around the country in some very big places, Mongataltry in the North Island, for instance, is something like 3,500 hectares. It's on a mountain, there's streams and rivers. So for them, it's very, very difficult to keep rodents out, and I believe they are having problems, particularly with mice. It's just so difficult. But because we have flat ground, it's small, and we can have so many bait stations out, and we work there all the time. So we can keep on top of it, we monitor it well. We're very confident that we can keep predators out of Riccarton Bush, yeah.
That's great. Well, once you got rid of the predators, what changes did you see in the forest?
Well, the vegetation really, there was one plant that above all others that really showed us that it was a good thing to do. There are 3 species of mistletoe in Riccarton Bush. They're parasitic on other plants, and possums just love mistletoe. And they'd always been munched right down the mistletoe to just a few stems. And since we've got rid of the possums, the mistletoes have flourished, and we have big clumps of mistletoe now on our trees.
And they're flowering?
And they're flowering, yeah.
And what colour are they?
Well, they're mainly a greeny yellow flower. We don't have the red flowering mistletoe, but it's really nice to see them. So that's just one. Yeah. The other one that the possum really likes is the 5-finger. We don't have a lot of 5-finger in Riccarton Bush, but we do notice that what is there is doing a lot better. Yeah.
Right. And what about bird life?
Well, the bird life, it's very hard to quantify how many birds you've got in Riccarton Bush. We've always had a reasonable fantail population, and it does fluctuate. In the winter, a lot of fantails die anyway. And you don't tend to notice them in the winter because on the ground in the bush it's very cold in the winter and there's no insect life, and because they're insect feeders they go up into the canopy where it's warmer and there are insects still on the move. So if you look up in the winter you do see fantails in the canopy. But it's hard to tell whether they're doing better than they were. I think they probably are, but it's very difficult. But the one bird that's really doing a lot better is the bellbird. Go back 10 years, you hardly ever heard a bellbird in Riccarton Bush. They are around more in Christchurch now. There's more in Christchurch than there used to be, but Riccarton Bush seems to be a place that they've found, and we have resident bellbirds now. We get a dawn chorus of bellbirds.
But
fantastic. They love it, and they're getting them in their gardens as well. Yeah. And we're seeing fledgling bellbirds. Well, we haven't found nests, but we're seeing young fledglings, so we know they're nesting there. And that's the beauty of this fence, is that it's a safe place now for birds to nest. And the cararoo, the native pigeon, we know is nesting in there as well. So that's really, really good.
That's great.
Because before we put the fence up, I'd seen rats going up trees, vertical trees, just straight up into them. And I think rats are probably the worst predator of the lot. They get into fantail nests, they get the young birds. So we're so pleased that it's working.
That's great.
Yeah.
And I understand that you've been slowly moving some new species back in, or ones that used to be there and have disappeared. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, we're actually working with the Department of Conservation on this. They're the experts on translocating bird species or whatever back into the bush. We've already moved some Canterbury geckos back in. Not many, but we've started. Doc's been helping us with that, and we've also put back in some weta. The weta were cleaned out by the rats. As you know, they're an invertebrate, a very big one. The Canterbury tree weta is quite big, about that big, and we've brought them in. We actually got them from the peninsula. Mike Bowie at the Lincoln University is the person who's been helping us with this, and Warren Chin of Doc has helped too. So they brought in some weta in these. These are called weta motels, and they're brought in and strapped to a tree with weta already in them. There's a hole in the bottom, and that's where they go in and out, and they live in these. Well, they should live in them, but we brought them in and we strapped them to a tree, and they stay for about a week, but they've moved out. Probably found better accommodation elsewhere. But
right.
We don't know how they're doing. Unfortunately, it's some months ago we released them. Until hopefully we start to see more weta and baby weta.
So you presume they've found a new home out in the bush?
I guess so.
You hope so.
Well, there's plenty of holes and hollows in the trees, so I would imagine that's where they've gone.
And do you have plans for any other species, bringing other insects or birds or lizards back in?
Small bird species we've talked about. I'm no expert on this, and the Department of Conservation have had conversations with us about the possibility of perhaps the tomtit, the rifleman, which are both insect feeders. They both have small territories.
Right.
Riccarton Bush being so small, of course, it would be an experiment. It would be a gamble in a way.
Yes.
And I don't think anybody could say they know what will happen until we actually do it. And it may be worth a try to bring some pairs of those birds back and just see if they stay. It's possible that they would go, and so it wouldn't work.
Right.
But it would be nice to think we could bring tomtit back. We actually saw a tomtit last summer on one day. It was a young bird, and it must have come out from the Port Hills where they still are.
Yes.
And I was with some Doc people, and fortunately, because we all saw it, and I couldn't believe it, because a tomtit had not been seen for decades in the bush.
It's quite a long flight.
Yeah, it is. But we only saw it that one day and it had gone again. Yep. But that's another possibility that they will self-introduce from the peninsula. And maybe the tui, the tui they're working on at Hinawai.
Yes.
And if the tui numbers build up on the peninsula, then maybe they'll find Riccarton Bush on their own. I don't think we would release tui, they're too big and they'd leave. But the small birds are a possibility.
Might find their way.
Yeah, sure.
Right. And does Riccarton Bush Trust have plans for any other improvements with the bush management there?
Well, the translocation thing, we hope to do a little more on that. The one bird that a lot of people talk about is the kiwi. I don't know quite how, but the word got out that we were going to put kiwi back in there and weka. and you can't do both. You do one or the other. But we never really thought we would do that. Personally, I felt that putting kiwi back in there was a bit of a risk, and it wouldn't be big enough. But we've since had a few talks with Doc about the kiwi recovery program and the kiwi nest egg operation, which is a program that takes eggs from kiwi in the wild where they will be predated and wouldn't stand a chance. They're incubated at a place like Willowbank in Christchurch, and then they're raised to a certain age at Willowbank, but then they need somewhere to go to get used to being in the wild before they actually are released in the wild. And they need to be brought up to a certain weight. I think it's about 1.2 kg.
Yes.
That weight they can look after themselves, and they can fend off stoats and rats and things. So it's been discussed, and it's thought that possibly Riccarton Bush could be this sort of creche area where we look after young kiwi for maybe 4 or 5 months till they gain the weight. They get used to being in the wild because it's a little bit like being in the wild, and then they're re-released into some wild place.
So kiwi nursery.
Yeah,
perhaps.
Yeah, and if we can be involved with that would be wonderful. You know, we'd be helping that kiwi recovery program, because I think kiwi are reducing by about 5% a year around the country, which is, you know, pretty sad.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Now, you have a book here, Riccarton Bush.
I do.
More too. Can you tell us about that?
Okay, well, this is a book that came out some time ago. It's edited by Brian Malloy, who's the botanist on the Board of Trustees. There's lots of people involved with this book. They've written a chapter each on various things. It's a great book, not only on Riccarton Bush, but it's a good book on natural history of Christchurch and human history. And there's heaps of information in there. And it's going for a bargain price, $20. Can be purchased at Riccarton House. So anybody going to Riccarton House, can pick up a bush. Well, Riccarton House, there's 2 houses on the site. The site itself is an historic site, Category 1 historic site. There's Dean's Cottage, of course, which is the oldest house in Christchurch. That's where the Deans lived before the big house was built. Both the Dean's brothers, John and William, sadly had died before the big house was built. But there's a very large house there, Riccarton House, and that's the house that the Deans lived in until 1939, I think. Anyway, it's now open to the public, Riccarton House. There's a restaurant there. There's a very good cafe where you can get a good cup of coffee. And we have 10 acres of house grounds, or just under 4 hectares of house grounds, which is a lovely place to walk around. You can have a walk into the ancient forest, Riccarton Bush, and then you can have a good cup of coffee at Riccarton House. And they do very good lunches there as well.
Great.
So we also do eco-tours. That's another thing that's reasonably recent. We've always done bushwalks there, but we've kind of upped it a little bit, and we do eco-tours into the bush, which is what I'm involved with, and we take people through the bush and explain it, and also do a little tour around the house grounds as well. And we're going to be doing that through the winter on Wednesday afternoons.
Okay.
And it can be combined with a guided tour of the house. There's a human history tour through Riccarton House, which is very good as well. And that's actually daily. That's done daily.
So how do people get in contact with you if they want to do that?
Well, they can just ring Riccarton House, and they can book a tour anytime.
Great.
Yeah.
And it must now be, I mean, there's always been a lot of people who have visited Riccarton Bush. I mean, I can remember doing it since I was a kid. I've always loved it.
Yeah.
I imagine you have a lot more people now. Do you have educational groups and schools going in there? What sort of people go there now?
Yeah, we do indeed. The school group work that we do there has increased over the years. I used to do all the guided tours for school groups, but now the Canterbury Museum education team have taken over most of that. I still do some of it. So we get mostly primary school children, but some secondary schools do use it as an education tool. And we do get university groups coming there studying. So as an education place, it's absolutely wonderful, right in the middle of the city.
Yes.
So accessible, and there's just so much in there.
It's a beautiful place to go inside. To me, it feels like a cathedral with this huge, tall, towering trunks and
the kahikateas.
It's really nice.
Yeah, it is.
A nice boardwalk. So it's very easy to walk through.
Yes, it's only if you walk around at a reasonable slow pace. It's only a half an hour to go right around.
Yeah.
And on a fine sunny day, even in winter, it's a lovely place. I mean, it's a lovely place to relax.
Yep.
And really, you know, if you go in there now, you're hearing bellbirds, you've got fantails flitting around. It's wonderful for fantails right at the moment because all the fledgling birds are out of the nests.
Yes.
So you're seeing mum and dad and 4 fledglings. So you might get 6 of them all flitting around you.
Right.
And you really do feel as though you're in Westland or somewhere like that. It's really quite remarkable. Yeah.
And what sort of feedback do you get from visitors?
Well, very, very positive. There are a lot of people in Christchurch actually that have never been into Riccarton Bush and they've lived there all their lives. And sometimes people will come up and say, we didn't know this was here. You know, this is fantastic.
Let's hope they see this.
Well, I hope so. Let's hope so.
Well, thank you very much for coming in. It's been really interesting hearing about Riccarton Bush and the predator-proof fence, and all the best to you and the Trust.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.